a lot of the insights that you've seen have come from some of the best brands in the world. These are the creme de la creme, if you like. And you may have the question, well, does this all hold for the rest of our database and for other brands? And the short answer to that is, well, yes. The longer answer comes from a bigger analysis that we've done across almost 4,000 brands, looking across multiple countries, multiple categories, some smaller brands, some larger, more established brands. And one of the things that we wanted to address right up front was when we looked at the brands that managed to grow, so those are the gold bars on the left, versus those that declined, we saw that what made quite a big difference was difference. And we've already had Charles and Graham talk a little bit about difference. Now, one of the warning signs here is that you'll see salience is really high amongst those brands that manage to decline. And so that suggests to us that salience on its own is obviously not enough. You need to make sure that your brand is managing to be different. And a big part of this, of the insight that we saw in this analysis was that growth is extremely rare. We found that only around 6% of brands grew in the first year, and we continued that analysis over another couple of years. So when we looked at brands that managed to grow again, there was a really tiny proportion of brands, only 1 in 10 of those. A number of them managed to maintain some of that growth that they gained in the first year, but actually quite a few of them lost the initial gains that they made. And focusing in on those brands that have managed to maintain some growth over the short term and then also into the longer term, we found 3 activities that they were specifically able to overperform on. And so that's what I'm going to talk to you a little bit about right now. We categorize those into overperforming around experience, exposure, and then also activation. So experience is really around the positive associations that you manage to create with your customers, your current customers, and that helps you to influence your repeat sales. The exposure is about influencing future sales, and that's one of the things that Graham mentioned earlier, some of those brands that had managed to remind and to refresh. You do need to make sure that you're able to influence future sales by creating predisposition, and we'll talk a little bit about that in the next few slides. And then lastly, activation. So activation is about creating those immediate sales, making sure that you manage to convert that predisposition into sales. So I'll talk about each of these in turn, and we'll start with experience. And now when we overperform on all 3 of those, we found that that small group of brands actually manages to get 46% growth. That's a huge number in terms, especially when you look at it in comparison to the average growth, which was under 1%. So that's a huge amount of growth. So when we looked at those that did manage to overperform on experience, those were the ones, as I said, that had created this really strong positive experience, created a whole lot of positive attributes and associations with your brand. You managed to get a 7% hit in terms of your growth. So you gain around 7%. But when we increase the performance on exposure, we can gain 27%, and that's where we get a really massive hit in terms of your overall growth. And then that will, when we get down to activation, you will add another 12% to that. And that adds up to your total 46%. What I'm going to do over the next few slides is I'll talk a little bit about each of those areas. But before I get to that, you can see that that 46% begins to get eroded if you start to underperform on some of these areas. So if you then underperformed on experience, you would drop down to only a gain of 30%. If you underperform on activation, you lose another chunk. But actually, when you underperform on exposure, all of that growth that you could have gotten is completely wiped out. So that's quite a huge finding in terms of exposure being one of the key aspects in terms of trying to create and maintain growth. So let's talk about each of these in turn, and we'll give you some examples as well from the data that we looked at. So in terms of experience, what that's really about is trying to create memorable moments. And memorable moments are important because that's what people choose between. What we get to keep from our experiences is a story. And what influences that story are the changes, the significant moments, the endings. And what happens to all of these moments? Well, most of them disappear. Most of those moments are forgotten completely. And so what we as brands need to be doing is to be able to create these memorable moments and actually manage to cut through. The reason that that's important is because it's the remembering self that is making those decisions. It makes those brand decisions. It's not the experiencing self. And to cut through and really make sure that you're well placed to get chosen, you need to make sure that you cut into that remembering self. Now, decision making can be quite complex, but when you get it right, so when you manage to create that predisposition and manage to build your brand correctly, you get this feeling of rightness. When people come to the shop shelf, they know what it is that they want to buy. There's a feeling of rightness, which is your intuitive movement towards a particular brand. There's obviously a lot of other stuff that comes in there, and there's a kind of experiential feedback loop that you can create through a really strong experience with your brand. However, you do need to be careful of the experience gap. So when you overpromise and underdeliver, you're of course going to have a relative hit in terms of your overall performance. What we found was that really strong performers will get stronger levels of recommendation, stronger levels of retention when they manage to deliver exactly what they promise. And that's also seen in some of the data from the Institute for Real Growth, where overperformers were the ones that managed to enable an ever-evolving experience, not just ticking off a list of functional items, but actually managing to create a real strong experience with the brand. Well, one of the examples that we found was looking at F&B, and F&B managed to focus on a service orientation and also did that with a really strong performance in technology. So harnessing technology to make sure that that experience is a lot more streamlined and a lot more compelling than it could have been. When it comes to exposure, your brand exposes itself to your consumers through multiple channels, of course. There are lots of ways that your consumers and your future consumers will come across your brand, whether it be online, whether it be through PR, through word of mouth, and of course, through your advertising as well. And when it comes to that content, your content needs to be strong, needs to be creative. It needs to convey meaningful and different associations. And when you manage to do that, you do set yourself up well in the short term, but also into the longer term by creating this predisposition. And it's not always easy to cut through because people are trying to block your brands, trying to look at other content, moving away and taking active steps to stop seeing your advertising. But when you do manage to cut through and when you do manage to have great content, the ROI can be quite strong, can be up to 10 times. But that kind of content on its own, really strong content on its own, is just entertainment. What is really important is for you to try and convey exactly what it is that you stand for. You need to have a clarity of image, and we found that when, over time, you do have that kind of clarity, that the consumers can see exactly what it is that you stand for, you can translate those positive associations into sales in a much stronger way over time. One brand that has had a really strong clarity of what it is that it stands for is a German organic baby foods brand called HIP. I see some nodding heads, some people do have heard of it. It's a brand that really has been very clear on what it is that it stands for. It's in terms of its ingredients, and then also that translates into its communications as well. So when people do come into that particular category, they know exactly what they're looking for, and they've already got some predisposition towards the brand. So closing the loop on those three areas that I was talking about, activation is about taking that predisposition that we've created and converting that into sales. And what are some of the things that we can do in that space? So there are two ways that people would come to shop your particular brand. And in the first case, they come in with a certain amount of predisposition, you sort of close the deal and they end up buying that particular brand. In the second case here, it might be that they were looking for something else, but somehow through a number of situational influences, you've managed to nudge them towards your brand and then actually converted them to buy your brand, even if they weren't necessarily predisposed to buy your brand in the first place. And obviously that first route is going to be the more efficient, the easier. If you've already managed to create that predisposition, there's no extra work for you to do. They'll just buy the brand. So that's one of the reasons why we want you to create some strong predisposition. Another good reason is that when you have that strong predisposition, you actually shorten the purchase process. And by shortening the purchase process, you're also reducing the possibility that people might end up buying something else as well. So you'll see here, with strong predisposition, shorter research time, and also a higher likelihood for that person to buy the actual brand. Now, of course, there's a very big role for strong brand assets to play, and that can be in a number of different forms. It could be your logos, it could be the music or the sound that you use, spokespeople, a number of different ways that you can remind people of those associations that they've created already, that you've managed to generate through your advertising and through your communication. So these brand assets will have a really strong role to play in the store at that last sort of mile. And one of the brands that we've seen is a Spanish brand that has been completely consistent across all of its touch points and really distinctive in terms of making sure that people know that this is the brand that we're looking at every place that they see the brand. So it then elicits and brings to mind all of those positive associations that people will have with the brand, and then hopefully get them to buy that particular brand. Now, tying that all together, we do think that you should be measuring at all of these different spaces. It might be that you have various different instruments. We're not suggesting that there's one metric that is going to be in each of these spaces. There are different qualitative inputs that will come into it, different passive measurements that might come into it. But on the whole, you should be looking at all of this in its entirety. You should be striving to create that predisposition we talked about, and you should be trying to balance across all of those three areas. So in summary, balance your investment across the buyer cycle on those three areas to create some sustained growth. Deliver that brand experience, because that allows you to make sure that you can create repeat purchase amongst your existing buyers. Grow your brand exposure so that you can create predisposition amongst future buyers and get them to buy your brand as well. Plan your brand activation to ensure that you create salience with meaning. And then lastly, inform your brand strategy to provide strong brand guidance.